Well, another blackout in South Australia, not statewide like the one in September, but like the ones in December and January and now February. There have been a shutdown. This was losing power from about 90,000 properties for more than half an hour last night in 40-degree plus temperatures. Now, a lot of political to and fro over this today. The Prime Minister weighed in this morning. Here's what he had to say.
Labor is drunk on left ideology on energy, and they are putting Australians' livelihoods, their businesses and their households at risk.
So the Turnbull government blaming South Australia's reliance on renewables, largely wind power. The state Labor government, though, in South Australia is blaming the National Energy Market Regulator. Here was the Minister this morning.
One of the things that I noticed we've been called on to do today, we're already doing. That is taking our energy out to the market and requiring that energy to be supplied by somebody that can bring new generation here to South Australia so that we can have secure, reliable, likely gas-fired generation that will back up our renewable energy. So they're the types of ideas that we'll be pursuing, but they're under consideration and action will be taken soon.
It's the Premier, of course, Jay Weatherill, and making it clear there that they've got to do something. Now, the option that he pointed to there was to have more likely gas-fired power as a backup for their renewables in South Australia. With me now is the Shadow Environment Minister, Mark Butler. Thanks for your time.
Hi, David.
What do you make of that, Jay Weatherill? Is he conceding there they need more fossil fuel-fired power in South Australia?
Well, I think broadly there is a consensus that the future build of electricity is going to be a mix of renewable energy, storage and gas-fired backup. So I think he's really restating a position that the Energy Council's talked about in the last week or two, particularly after Malcolm Turnbull talked about building a new coal-fired generation. Alan Finkel has talked about, the chief scientist, and many others. So,
is he saying they're relying too heavily on renewables right now?
Well, I think what the Premier is saying is that they've lost faith in the national electricity market.
No, he's saying we need more gas-fired power.
Yeah. Well, I think that is the question for a whole range of jurisdictions, including South Australia, depending on how quickly you can roll out storage. Well, I think let's be clear about what happened yesterday, first of all. It's a simple matter of arithmetic.
All right, well, let's go through that.
There was enough fossil fuel generation in the system in South Australia to satisfy the demand. But AEMO, the energy regulator, did not order Pelican Point, which is state-of-the-art, relatively new gas-fired generator, actually in my own electorate of Port Adelaide, to switch on its second unit.
Well, we've got the statement from the energy market regulator you're talking about there. They haven't acknowledged they did anything specifically wrong. Here's what they said. A number of market notices were issued to all generators in the lead-up to this instruction, requesting a market response to be provided due to the increased demand as a result of the high temperatures. And they go on to say that they did not receive sufficient bids into the market to maintain supply-demand balance.
And what we've seen since is the owners of Pelican Point, Engie, a big French multinational, which happens to own Hazelwood Power Station as well, issue a notice since then saying that they were not able, under the existing electricity market rules, to bid that second unit in. They could only switch it on if directed by the market regulator, which is a federal regulator.
From them as well.
That's quite clear. I don't think there's really
who's right and who's wrong?
I think it's quite clear the regulator made a mistake. I think it's quite clear the regulator should have predicted that demand would continue to be very high. It was still 41 degrees at 7 o'clock in Adelaide last night.
Demanded that
and
it
has power to direct generators to turn their generators on.
I'm a little confused.
It's used these powers over the course of this summer.
The regulator asks the market, we need more power. Who wants to supply it? And here's the price we're paying. But Pelican Point, are they really saying they can't turn on the power unless they're directed to?
That second unit, there's something about that second unit that required the operator to direct it to turn it on. And the operator knew that.
Why does the...
Well, I'm not quite sure what the details are. The simple fact of the matter, though, is that
they have to wait to be told by the regulator before they can turn it on. They were asked by the regulator.
This is a relatively straightforward power the regulator has. I mean, yes, we've had a market in operation now for some time that assumes that companies will bid into the market and that will deliver enough electricity for households and businesses. But there's always been a fail-safe mechanism that says when the market operator knows that there is going to be a question over whether there's sufficient supply, it has the power to direct generators to turn their generators on and supply electrons into the system. It's used it over summer.
They asked for the extra power, but they didn't direct
Yeah. Well, I think it's clearly a mistake. And really, instead of Josh Frydenberg spending the day doing the old political rant that they do about renewable energy, he should be asking the question, why did the market operator not take that decision? It's taken that decision over the course of this summer in other jurisdictions. We've got the possibility of load shedding happening or blackouts forced on New South Wales households and businesses.
You're blaming Josh Frydenberg here, as you have been today, and I think you even said this morning he should have directed the regulator to...
No, I said he should be asking questions, given that the regulator reports to him.
Who does have the power to direct the regulator?
Well, it's the COAG Energy Council ultimately, and it's about the market
Premier
rules.
Jay Weatherill, isn't it?
No. The one person who doesn't have the power is the South Australian government.
What did he do then during the South Australian blackout in September? I thought he did use that.
Well, they certainly talked very heavily to the generators there. We now have a national electricity market that in South Australia particularly is operated by multinational private companies. The old days, the South Australian Government Energy Minister would have rung the generator, which was a state-owned business or a state business, and said, turn your generator on. But because of the introduction of the market and the privatisation of all of these businesses out to private companies, the South Australian government now relies on, as does the New South Wales government,
in that blackout
the
in
market
September,
operator to operate.
Jay Weatherill did intervene.
Yeah,
so why aren't you attacking him today for not intervening here?
Well, because that was a longer term event. I mean, these heat events.
It was heating up. We knew there was an issue there.
And all state governments, New South Wales in the NEM at least, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia and the ACT, as this extreme heat event sweeps through the southeast of Australia, are entitled to expect that the market operator would do their job. And if the market operator doesn't do their job, they're entitled to expect that the federal minister to whom that operator reports would be actually asking some questions about the operation of the market instead of playing politics.
Well, he says he has spoken to the regulator again this morning, and they dispute that they did anything wrong. So, but anyway, do you take his point at least that the reliance on wind power was a problem to the extent that when the wind wasn't blowing, it was only providing 2.5%, and that's why we got into this situation in the first place?
Well, that's why we have as much gas as we have in South Australia, but we expect that it will be turned on at the critical time. That's why we have the interconnector with Victoria. That's why there are discussions about whether, as growth happens in South Australia, there might be a need for more gas.
Yeah. Well, the interconnector was going at maximum strength to Victoria.
But again, it comes back to mathematics. The interconnector plus the gas generation that's been built in South Australia, most of which is in my electorate, if it was all turned on, there would have been no problem.
Yeah, well, it wasn't, and that's the thing.
Yes, and that's the question that Josh Frydenberg should be asking. Well, instead of continuing every time there's a hiccup in the national electricity system.
He's certainly saying there's a question here, and it seems Jay Weatherill's now moving in that direction as to whether you need more gas-fired power or coal-fired power, because...
Well, no one's talking about more coal-fired power.
I think the federal government might be.
The federal government might be. No one else in the industry thinks
gas-fired power. Jay Weatherill is now basically saying we need more gas-fired power. So the reliance on renewables right now isn't working.
Well, I come back to the point, if the market worked properly yesterday, we would not have an issue in South Australia. If the gas-fired generators that are already in the system were turned on, and if there was a question about whether they would be turned on, if the market operator had done its job, and understood that there was a supply-demand issue.
It seems to me the problem at Pelican Point was, the regulator asked them, but they wanted something stronger. They wanted a direction.
No, they required something stronger. Is in the statement. They required
that's in their statement. I know, but the regulator is saying that it asked for more supply. But anyway, you wouldn't get this situation at all if you had other suppliers. If you had more gas-fired power, or indeed more coal-fired power in South Australia, you wouldn't have this problem at all.
Well, if you had a surplus of power just sitting idle waiting for this sort of event to happen, that's right. But
that's what Jay Weatherill is
talking about.
Do you agree with him? Just getting back to this, do you agree with him that you need some idle capacity there, some gas-fired power?
Well, that's what that second unit at Pelican Point is. It's idle capacity. It only operates in these sorts of events.
So he's wrong to be looking at...
No, I think what the Premier is talking about is planning for the future, and there may well need to be more gas-fired generation in the South Australian market to give some extra fat into the system, so we don't end up in this position as well.
So you
and
agree
also
with
to
him
cater for some growth.
There may need to be more gas-fired power in South Australia because there's too much reliance on renewables.
No, because we need to also cater for growth, and I think all of the sensible people in the industry...
build more wind towers and...
No, but you are going to need to have a proper balance between intermittent renewable generation, gas-fired backup, and the storage or battery revolution that's starting to sweep Australia as well. And I think getting that balance right is going to be a challenge for all jurisdictions. South Australia being ahead of the rest is going to be, I think, the test case for that.
The test case, the experiment.
Yeah.
as Joe Weatherall's put it.
There always had to be a jurisdiction that led the way, and it's important to point out that all of the renewable energy
of South Australia,
all of the renewable energy, all of the renewable energy that's been built in South Australia has been built as part of the renewable energy target that John Howard first put in place, and then was legislated by the federal parliament. It's not been a state. It's a federal scheme that private companies make decisions about. It's actually got nothing to do with the state government. That much wind has been built there.
If there is, and you agree now, there may need to be more gas-fired power in South Australia as a redundancy or a backup for when the wind's not blowing.
Cater for growth into the future.
Well, Joe Weatherall is saying for when the, as a backup, he said, for when situations like this arise, who is going to build? Who is going to invest in a gas-fired plant that's only there to be turned on when the wind's not blowing?
Well, I think that's why
not some global, energy player.
Well, I think if you talk to the electricity industry, that is the fossil fuel investment of the future. I don't think anyone is going to invest in coal-fired generation for a range of reasons. Partly it's exposure to carbon pricing into the future, but also because the balance between the capital costs of building a gas-fired generation and the operating costs work much better for the situation that you're talking about. Really, to get your money back for a coal-fired generator, you have to have it operating at about 80% of the time.
Whereas gas, you can just turn on and off.
Gas, you can turn it on and off. The capital cost is not as significant as the cost of a coal-fired generator.
It's still an investment, though, that you're not going to get used unless it's a backup requirement when the wind's not blowing. Wouldn't it really require a taxpayer investment to make that happen?
Well, I think they're the sorts of things that the Premier has indicated the state government is looking at very, very closely, and we'll see some of that work out over the coming weeks. But the industry is very clear about this, and Alan Finkel as he's been doing his review of the system, I think has heard these messages as well, that the future is a mix in investment between renewables, gas and storage. And this is an imperative for Australia. I mean, AGL tells us that 3/4 of the coal and gas-fired generators we have in Australia are already operating beyond their design life. We need to think about an investment plan. We're getting nothing from this government. They dumped the emissions intensity scheme that was recommended to them in December by the Chief Scientist, the CSIRO, the Energy Markets Commission, all state governments, Liberal and Labor alike. They dumped it because of some protests from Tony Abbott and Corey Bernardi, and they're left with nothing.
Well, OK, but it's, as you say, the test case, the experiment South Australia that's pushing to this 50% renewable target. The West Australian Labor Party is apparently now talking about this as well. Would you encourage them to go with a 50% target?
Well, I think what we need is a federal government that's talking about investment beyond 2020. And what I've said is that the federal Labor's position is the preference is to have a single scheme at a national level. But as happened when John Howard resisted any sort of consideration of modernising our electricity system, state governments will fill a vacuum. State parties will ensure there's a debate in state election campaigns about renewable energy development if they think that the federal government is doing nothing.
So, OK, ideally a national 50% target.
That's very much our position. Well, you can have a debate about the target. We've got a position, but there's got to be a federal framework for renewing our electricity infrastructure beyond 2020, and this government just refuses even to discuss that.
Well, OK, but I note you have a nuanced position that's not a 50% renewable energy target.
Oh, no, we do. We have a position that at least 50% of Australia's electricity by 2030, so in about a decade and a half, should be delivered from renewable resources.
All right, but can you understand a lot of people hearing that, looking at South Australia and what's been happening every month now, and thinking it's not working?
Well, I think what you need is stable policy, and this is what you heard even from the Energy Council head who wrote an op-ed in the Fin Review yesterday, that what we have at the moment is utter stasis. They have complete inertia in the electricity industry at a time when we should be renewing. And as the 2020s roll out, you will see a revolution in the way in which we can manage the intermittency of solar and wind energy through the advent of battery storage, but also through pumped hydro storage.
Works and
well, it's not a question of hope. They're being rolled out now, and the costs are coming down dramatically.
Perhaps, but battery storage is still deemed too expensive here for anyone to invest at that large scale. But so you are still saying, despite what we've seen again and again now in South Australia, we need a national 50% target, and
we need a proper plan behind it. We need an emissions intensity scheme recommended by all of those bodies I talked about. How can you be sure
we won't see these blackouts elsewhere?
Because what we're seeing at the moment, like, none of these blackouts are directly connected to renewable energy. They've been either storm-related, or as I said yesterday, they were because of a failure.
Or a failure but by the regulator. Yes, they all have, but if you
we see events all over the electricity system. The price spiking events we've seen in Queensland over the last several weeks have not been remarked upon at all by this government because it doesn't suit their political agenda, because Queensland has about 7% renewable energy. The fact that power prices have been hovering above South Australia's, they're about twice the South Australian power price there, doesn't suit the Frydenberg-Turnbull agenda that this is all about renewable energy.
So we'll still get blackouts, whatever we do. And that's the Queensland evidence that even when they don't have...
We've got a danger of load shedding in New South Wales this afternoon because of the supply and demand balance. Again, a state that's heavily coal with very little renewable energy compared to South Australia, WA and Victoria. I mean, these things are happening across the system all the time, but we've got a federal government that just insists upon trying to frame this as an anti-renewables thing and promote their plan for building new coal-fired generation.
Mark Butler, the Shadow Environment Minister, good to talk to you as always. Thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. And let's hope we don't get more blackouts as the temperature really does heat up over the next few days in a lot of our capital cities. Let's take a quick break and we'll be back with the Gold Pass travel entitlement. The government this week is moving to get rid of it, but one of their own backbenchers is fighting that move. Stay with us.